Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osha. Today is June the 22nd, 2026. We're still in Men's Mental Health Month. And while I'm not going to discuss a man today, I'm going to talk about a woman. That's Martha Mitchell. Martha Mitchell was the wife of the only U.S. Attorney General John Mitchell, who went to jail, was convicted, and went to prison for his role. Uh, went to prison for his um, role while in office. Of course, that role was his involvement in the Watergate scandal. Ironically, his principal, whom he ended up destroying his wife and his marriage to protect. That's Richard Nixon. Didn't go to prison himself. He was pardoned by his successor, President Gerald Ford. Um, Richard Nixon would infamously rather, describe refer to Martha Mitchell in his interview with British journalist David Frost as the Martha problem, and it would say that if it hadn't been for Martha Mitchell, there would be no Watergate, right? So today I'm going to talk about the Martha Mitchell effect. It's actually something psychiatrists and psychologists use. The Martha Mitchell effect basically means when a psychiatrist or a psychologist um, you know misrepresents the true perceptions, right? The true perceptions and facts that have been stated by a patient, and he misrepresents them as delusional, and subsequently uh, misdiagnoses them with a mental illness, right? Because that's what happened with Martha Mitchell. And so Martha Mitchell, again, was the wife of the Attorney General John Mitchell, who was a lawyer, and he would eventually leave his position as the Attorney General to manage the president's committee for the re-election of the president, also known, its acronym was CREEP, right? Because these guys also did really creepy things. Of course, that committee was responsible for the Watergate break-in. I've done videos explaining Watergate, and I've done videos even explaining the kidnapping of Martha Mitchell. So when the Watergate scandal broke, right, Martha Mitchell and the Attorney General were in a hotel in California. And so when they called the Attorney General realized that he didn't want Martha Mitchell to leak the information of that would link the White House to the Watergate break-in. So he tried to cover up everything. So he went back to Washington and he asked for his wife to stay at the hotel. She ended up being kidnapped as she she was held captive and she was kidnapped. So she got to know of the break-in, right? Because she saw an article in the LA Times, and she saw the name of one of the burglars that had been arrested, James McCord, and she realized, James McCord was not just an ex CIA agent, right, who worked in the for her husband in the committee to re-elect the president. That's CREEP. I'll just keep calling it CREEP, right? He worked in CREEP, but he was also the bodyguard of her daughter, right? So immediately she put two and two together. She was a sharp woman. She realized that the break-in at the Watergate was linked to the illegal activities of the White House. Now she feared that her husband was going to be the fall guy, because she didn't like Nixon, and she thought Nixon was basically threw everybody under the bus. So everybody who did illegal, dirty things for him, which he did, right? And so she immediately called somebody in the press, and while she was talking, she was there was an FBI guy, Stephen King, ex-FBI guy agent, whom they had guarding her at the hotel to make sure she didn't leave, because they didn't want her to leak information to the press. She was in a habit of over listening in on her husband's conversation, rifling through his papers, and after a nightcap, she would, she'd call people in the press and start telling them what was going on. At the time, she was immensely popular. Everybody knew her. They said she was more popular than the Secretary of State, and many people in she was more popular than the Vice President in America. People knew her more, right? They called her Martha, Mouth of the South, right? Because she was from the South. So, and by the way, they lived in an expensive apartment, duplex in Watergate, right? In the Watergate complex, right? Watergate was a multi-purpose complex. I've done a video describing it, and so they lived there. There'd been a break-in, but now she was in a hotel in California, and they were holding her captive. So Stephen King yanked the cord from the wall, the phone cord from the wall as she was talking, and she tried to leave. Then Nixon's lawyer, right? Nixon's personal lawyer would call a psychiatrist to restrain her. So they sedated her, tranquilized her, jabbed her, injected her in the butt, right, in the bum, so she wouldn't leave. So so she'd be sedated. Eventually, she was transferred to a country club in New York. When she tried to escape, 5 men pinned her down, and the struggle left her in stitches. And then eventually, everybody was looking for her, right? And she eventually started to call the press and say, look, that the Watergate break-in was linked to Richard Nixon, right? The White House aides immediately started a smear campaign to discredit her, and they started to leak information to the press that she was an alcoholic and that she was mentally unstable, that she had a mental illness. And so when she would call the press would dismiss, what she was saying, right? So they dismissed it that, okay, she had a mental illness, and they started to leak that, okay, she was actually convalescing in a psychiatric hospital in Connecticut. And back then, if you'd been to a psychiatric hospital, like, okay, anything that you were cuckoo, anything you said was crazy. And so you could see the evil, sinister methods of Richard Nixon and his aides. So nobody believed her, right? Unfortunately, eventually, the man her husband, that she was trying very hard to protect, decided to choose to protect his president, Richard Nixon, over his wife. He moved out of the house and they separated. They never saw each other again. But he did some terrible things to her, things that would have probably contributed to her death. When he moved out, he took their daughter, right, and he took custody of her daughter and went to the courts and said she was mentally unstable and she could not take care of the daughter. He isolated her financially, right? He withdrew all funds from her, so she had no money. And when she was basically isolated, she was evicted from the Watergate because he didn't pay for the place. So she was forced to live, and because of the Watergate, eventually the Watergate scandal will break due to the resourceful and dogged journalism of Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. But before everything eventually unraveled, because the burglars had been paid, they were promised money, right, that they should stay, that they should be silent, they shouldn't link the break-in to Richard Nixon or the White House. And of course the White House kept lying, saying that, it was just a third-rate burglar attempt. They dissociated themselves from the break-in. But eventually James McCord, even though he'd committed perjury, he would eventually write the judge while he was in prison, because he realized that Richard Nixon was probably going to throw them on the bus. It was going to abandon them. And then he admitted that they had committed perjury, and eventually everything unraveled. you know, Nixon's aides, they were charged, they were indicted. So was John Mitchell. Richard Nixon was eventually forced to resign in August of 1974, and everything, eventually came out. And of course, her husband, John Mitchell, was convicted and went to prison because they committed perjury. They covered up and all the illegal activities. Unfortunately for Martha Mitchell, she would she was abandoned and isolated by her friends and family because of the Watergate scandal. Everybody distanced themselves from her. She had no money. She had no family. She ended up, going to hospital, and her husband refused to pay the alimony that he had been ordered to pay, and so she developed a multiple myeloma, a rare form of blood cancer that originated from the bone marrow, and she subsequently died. She died at the age of 57. So, people claim that the sinister and invidious methods of Nixon and his aides and her husband, and the trauma it caused her, the kidnapping, the injection, the isolation, holding her captive, that all of those things, of course, may have contributed to her developing cancer, and her isolation. It led to her death as well. So that's the Martha Mitchell effect. It's also, related to something called the curse of Cassandra, right? So eventually, when she was vindicated, when the Watergate scandal eventually unraveled, right, and Nixon resigned, his aides, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, went to prison, and of course John Mitchell, the only Attorney General, U.S. Attorney General to ever go to prison. Ironically, she was destroyed because she was trying to really protect her husband. She believed Nixon was going to make her husband the fall guy because he was a chairman of the campaign to re-elect the committee to re-elect the president, and they were the ones who broke in, who were doing the bugging, who were framing people. They were doing all sorts of illegal stuff, and he was the one who controlled the money because that was what he was. John Mitchell was, he had been a Wall Street lawyer, right? And he was known for inventing a form of municipal bonds, the moral obligation bonds. I remember I actually did it in governmental accounting for moral obligation bonds. So unfortunately, his involvement with Richard Nixon would destroy him, and he would end up destroying his wife as a result. So she's known. She was, when she was vindicated, of course it was too late. She died as a result of the cancer, and she was dubbed by the press as the Cassandra, the Cassandra of of Watergate, right? The Cassandra of Watergate, of the White House. Now, Cassandra, this relates. The analogy is in reference to the Trojan War, right, and Greek mythology. Of course, this is appropriate, and I'm just going to quickly talk about the curse of Cassandra, because it's related to the Odyssey, which is coming up. I don't know if I'll be able to see it, but I read the book of the Odyssey by Homer. Of course, it stars Matt Damon, one of my favorite actors, as Odysseus, right? Odysseus of the nimble wits. Odysseus, of course, was the one who came up with the idea of sending the Greeks, the Trojans, the Trojan horse, as a gift to be able to penetrate the impregnable walls of Troy. Now, Cassandra had warned the Trojans, right? She had warned the Trojans that, hey, the Trojan horse, that this was how the Greeks were going to invade Troy, and she had warned of the Trojan horse, but nobody listened to her, just like Martha Mitchell, right? The Martha Mitchell effect, people dismiss true perceptions, right, of the speaker as delusional and a mental illness, as a sign of a mental illness, right? Because they don't have any evidence, proving the contrary, right? A psychiatrist in a psychiatric hospital, similar to the Pygmalion effect. I've done a video describing the Pygmalion effect. But this is the Martha Mitchell effect, right? So the psychiatrist who has limited time doesn't know the patient, and people in authority like Richard Nixon, the president of the United States. I'm not saying that was what he did, or his aides, his personal lawyers are telling the psychiatrist that, well, this person is delusional, she's hallucinating, she's saying fantasies, things are not true, and the psychiatrist has no way to prove, in the absence of facts to disprove, right? To disprove or to prove what the patient is saying, then he concludes, right, that, well, what she's saying is false, right? So in logic, it's called argumentum ad ignorantium, right? So argument, it's a false way of reasoning, right? Which it's arguing from ignorance, right? That ignorance of the fact, ignorance of the truth, not having the truth, basically proves that it is a lie, right? You can say sort of that's what it is. So that's also the Mitchell effect. So let me get back to the curse of Cassandra. So Cassandra was actually, she had been given a gift by one of Zeus's sons. Again, this goes back to Greek mythology, right? Greek son, one of his sons, Apollo, whose twin sister was Artemis, right? So Apollo was the god of war, the god of music, poetry, and the god of prophecy, right? And this is in Greek mythology again. So it was a god of prophecy, and he saw Cassandra, she was exceptionally beautiful, and he was smitten by her beauty. So he blessed her with a gift of prophecy, that she should be able to prophesy things accurately. But he did it, with the expectation that she would requite, she would accept his romantic advances. But she didn't. When she refused, he cursed her, right? In anger, he cursed her that, well, he let her retain the gift of prophecy, right? That she could foretell the future, but that nobody would ever believe her, right? Nobody would ever believe her. So that was the curse of Cassandra. So she would tell people of what would happen, but nobody would ever believe her. People would dismiss what she was saying. So that's the curse of Cassandra. So she foretold of the Trojan War, that the Greeks would use the Trojan horse to invade Troy and bring about its downfall. She told them, instead of the Trojans preparing against it, her father was a king. Her father was King Priam, right? And Paris was her brother. Hector was her brother. I think King Priam had like 50 kids or so. So nobody believed Cassandra, right? So that's the analogy, the parallel of the Martha Mitchell effect. Martha Mitchell was already warning the public that, hey, Nixon the White House was responsible for the Watergate break-in, but immediately the Nixon White House started the smear campaign, and they were calling her mentally unstable. She was an alcoholic, and so the journalists, who were mainly male and misogynistic, they ignored her, they dismissed her as well, ironically. So that's the Martha Mitchell effect, which is also similar to the curse of Cassandra. My name is Olurotimi Osha, and I will keep you posted. Thank you.